What is the meaning of this?
Hello, my friends. Tonight I want to take you into a story that feels more like a nightmare staged in some dark theatre than a chapter pulled from real history. And yet every word of it truly happened in France, during the storm of revolution. This is the tale of Philippe Égalité, a duke born into unimaginable wealth. The man who betrayed his own royal bloodline and who ultimately became a victim of the very fire he thought he could control. It is not simply a story of one aristocrat losing his head. It is a warning about ambition, betrayal, and the terrible mistake of believing you can tame the fury of the crowd. Philippe was born in April of 1747, inside a magnificent palace, at a time when France still dazzled the world with the brilliance and extravagance of its aristocracy. The Orléans family into which he was born was second only to the royal Bourbon dynasty itself. Their estates and fortunes so vast that even German princes looked on with envy. From his earliest days, Philippe breathed the air of luxury, surrounded by gold, fine wine, and endless banquets. He quickly understood that he was not just another nobleman. He was heir to a financial empire that raked in tens of millions of livres each year. While millions of French peasants survived on black bread, onions, and scraps, that contrast shaped him, filling him with both arrogance and a burning belief that the destiny of France could be bent to his will. As he grew older, Philippe turned away from the blind loyalty to the crown that had defined generations of his ancestors. Instead, he sought out the salons of the Enlightenment, places where dangerous new ideas were being sharpened like knives, where men like Voltaire and Rousseau openly attacked the divine right of kings and dreamed of a society built on reason and equality. Philippe was not just a listener, he was a patron, pouring money into these gatherings, sponsoring fiery pamphlets, and buying influence among intellectuals. In those years, the beast called revolution began to take shape, and Philippe fancied himself its master, imagining he could ride the wave of change and emerge as the guiding hand of a new France. But revolution is no chessboard, and the people are no silent pawns. What he thought he could steer was in fact a wildfire that burned without mercy. Philippe believed that with enough money and clever maneuvering, he could fan the flames just high enough to weaken the monarchy without consuming himself. And so, in 1789, when the first sparks ignited in Paris, he made the choice that shocked Europe. He turned his back on his noble peers and walked into the chamber of the Third Estate, dressed not in jewels and silk, but in a plain black coat, standing shoulder to shoulder with the commoners. To the masses, it was a breathtaking gesture, a duke siding with the people. To Queen Marie Antoinette, it was treachery. She named him the gravedigger of the monarchy. As the revolution gathered speed, Philippe placed the ultimate bet, one that would forever define his legacy. In January of 1793, King Louis XVI was put on trial, and more than 700 deputies rose one by one to cast their votes, some calling for exile, some for mercy. But when Philippe's name was called, the hall went silent. He spoke 4 words that shocked even hardened revolutionaries. "I vote for death." His cousin, the king himself, stared at him in disbelief as blood condemned blood. And when the votes were tallied, it was Philippe's choice that tipped the balance toward execution. With that act, he became known as the traitor duke, the noble who had betrayed his own king. Yet that betrayal did not save him. The revolution does not keep friends. It only devours. Within months, as France found itself at war with Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and half of Europe, Philippe's own son deserted to the Austrians. Suddenly, the entire Orléans family fell under suspicion. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety dug into his dealings and found letters, bank transfers, whispered connections with enemies of the Republic. In the fall of 1793, Philippe was dragged into the cold stone cells of the Conciergerie, the prison that swallowed its victims whole and returned them only to the guillotine. On November 6th of that same year, the crowd of Paris finally got the spectacle they had been waiting for. For 4 long years they had dreamed of seeing the blood of Orléans spill onto the cobblestones. And now the moment had come. Tens of thousands packed the streets, not merely to see justice but to taste revenge. They remembered the 12 palaces, the dozens of mansions, the endless fortune that his family had hoarded while they starved. As Philippe climbed the wooden steps, people hurled rotten vegetables, stones, even chamber pots. He tried to speak, but was drowned out by the roar. Death to the traitor. Seconds later, the blade flashed, and the Duke's head dropped into the wicker basket. But the story does not end there. For months afterward, a rumor would spread that still chills the imagination. When gravediggers reopened the lime pits where the bodies of the condemned were dumped, they found more corpses than had been recorded, and among them was one body that bore strange, horrifying marks. The fingernails were broken, dirt packed beneath them. Scratches covered the arms, signs of a man who had clawed desperately in the dark. Could it have been Philippe himself? Had the guillotine failed, leaving him stunned but alive, only to wake buried beneath lime and earth, suffocating and thrashing until death claimed him at last? The authorities moved quickly to cover it up, altering records and silencing anyone who spoke, but the whisper endured that the betrayer Duke met not the clean death of the blade, but the nightmare of being buried alive. And that, my friends, is only the opening of this grim tale. Philippe Égalité thought he was clever enough to ride the storm of revolution, but in the end, he was consumed by it. His story will lead us through glittering palaces, through betrayals whispered in salons, through the roar of mobs and the thud of the guillotine, and finally into the cold silence of a mass grave. So stay with me, because what you have just heard is only the beginning, and the deeper we go, the darker it becomes. All right, let us drift further together, deeper into this tale, as if you are lying back with your eyes half closed, the sound of my voice like a slow tide washing against the shore, carrying you into the second part of Philippe Égalité's story. You have heard the shocking prelude of his betrayal, of his fateful vote, and the cruel roar of the guillotine. But to understand why this man chose such a path, why he believed he could step into the fire and walk away untouched, we must return to the beginning, to the velvet-draped cradle of his youth, and wander slowly through the corridors of privilege that shaped his heart and seeded his downfall. Philippe was born in April of 1747, in the Grand Palais of Saint-Cloud, into a world gilded and perfumed, where even the servants lived better than the peasants who tilled the fields beyond the palace walls. His father, the Duke of Orléans, commanded lands so vast that they stretched farther than the eye could see. Orchards, vineyards, forests, villages, each acre feeding coins into the coffers of the family. Imagine the sound of it. Year after year, 24 million livres flowing like a golden river, while outside the gates, men and women clung to survival with crusts of bread and bowls of onion soup. For Philippe, this was not excess. It was the air he breathed, the rhythm of life itself, and like a lullaby sung to him in infancy, it shaped his mind to believe that power was not given, but inherited, that wealth was not fortune but destiny. As he grew, he wandered beneath the painted ceilings of his family's halls, listening to musicians play in candlelit chambers, watching courtiers whisper their schemes, observing how gold could bend even the proudest nobleman to obedience. These early impressions were a kind of schooling in themselves. His tutors lectured him on Latin, on Greek, on the histories of Rome and Carthage. But what Philippe truly learned was subtler. Quieter, that influence was a currency more potent than coin. That alliances were built not only on blood, but on favors and secrets. Even as a boy, he studied the faces of those around him, memorizing the flickers of envy, désir, and fear. And somewhere deep inside, he began to imagine himself not just as a participant in this glittering world, but as the conductor of its music. By the time Philippe reached manhood, the shadow of his inheritance loomed over him like a crown carved from iron and velvet. The Orleans family was a dynasty within a dynasty, second only to the Bourbons, who sat upon the throne, and yet so wealthy, so entangled in the arteries of French society, that their approval or disapproval could sway the fortunes of kings. Philippe knew this, felt it with every bow made before him. Every door opened at his approach. But rather than inspiring gratitude or humility, it ignited in him a restless hunger. To be second was never enough. He wished not only to stand among princes, but to carve his name into the marrow of history as the man who dared to guide France into a new age. The years passed, and in 1769, Philippe married Louise Marie de Bourbon-Penthièvre, one of the richest heiresses in the kingdom, her dowry alone worth 6 million livres. Estates stretching from Normandy to the Loire Valley, it was a match that could have cemented his place forever among the most powerful of men. Yet money to Philippe was only a tool, never a destination. With his new fortune, he expanded his reach, purchasing theatres, gambling houses, and sponsoring grand salons in Paris, the intellectual playgrounds of the Enlightenment. These salons were not mere gatherings of polite conversation, they were crucibles where ideas were forged hot and sharp enough to cut down monarchs. Voltaire himself, sharp-tongued and merciless, was whispered in those rooms, his words dissolving the sacred veil of kingship. To most nobles, these were dangerous thoughts to avoid. But to Philippe, they were instruments he could play. Notes of dissent that could be conducted into a symphony with himself as the hidden composer. Yet every fortune has its shadow, and Philippe's greatest shadow was the Palais Royal, his Parisian stronghold, a palace within a city, bustling with commerce by day and thrumming with vice by night. Beneath its arcades, 40 shops sold everything from silk stockings to seditious pamphlets. By evening, the galleries transformed into a carnival of red lanterns, where 300 prostitutes worked beneath the glow, and the air rang with laughter, arguments, drunken songs, and whispers of rebellion. Revolutionary tracts were hawked in plain sight for a few sous apiece, all under the watchful windows of Philippe's own residence. And what did the Duke do? He allowed it, even encouraged it. For chaos filled his purse more quickly than order, and secrets gathered beneath his roof like gold dust, ready to be traded. The crown collected taxes, but Philippe collected whispers. And whispers in a time of unrest were more dangerous than swords. It was within these walls that Philippe began to gamble, not just with dice and cards, but with the future of France itself. He believed that by loosening the leash of dissent, by feeding pamphlets and speeches into the restless hunger of the people, he could weaken the monarchy just enough for him to step forward as a kind of savior. Imagine him walking through the arcades at night, the smell of roasted chestnuts and cheap wine in the air, hearing orators railing against the king while prostitutes offered their services to drunken soldiers, all of it swirling together into a chaotic marketplace of sin and sedition. To outsiders, it might have looked like corruption, but to Philippe, it was a stage, and he was directing the play. By the late 1780s, the cracks in the kingdom had become canyons. France was drowning in debt, the treasury nearly empty. The king forced to summon the Estates General for the first time since 1614. Philippe seized the moment. When the gathering opened in May of 1789, he refused to sit with the nobles as his blood demanded. Instead, he crossed the hall to stand with the Third Estate, cloaked not in silks, but in the simplicity of a plain black coat, as if to announce to the world that he was not just a duke, but a man of the people. The gesture shocked the court, electrified the radicals, and whispered in every ear that perhaps the monarchy was not eternal. Perhaps even blood royal could be repurposed for a new order. To Queen Marie Antoinette, it was an act of pure betrayal, and she never forgave him, naming him in her private words the very gravedigger of the crown. And so the stage was set, the currents of revolution swirling faster, the smell of fear and excitement heavy in the streets, the old order trembling like an ancient oak struck by lightning. Philippe, with his wealth, his salons, his palais royal teeming with sedition, and his carefully crafted image of solidarity with the people, believed he could harness it all, ride it like a skilled horseman, and guide it toward a future where he might rule from behind the curtain. But history, like the storm, cannot be tamed by ambition alone, and the man who thought he could dance with revolution was already stepping onto a floor slick with blood. And as you lie there now, listening to this slow unraveling, let your mind picture the young Philippe in his candlelit chambers, quill scratching across parchment as he funds the presses that will one day roar against the very monarchy he was born to protect. Let the thought drift gently over you like a cloud, that in his eagerness to control the winds of change, he was already setting loose forces that would tear not only his enemies apart, but himself as well. For the revolution was not a game of strategy, not a carefully laid chessboard. It was a firestorm, and Philippe, whether he knew it or not, had already thrown himself into the flames. That, dear listener, is where we leave him for now, in the glow of his own ambition, confident, wealthy, reckless, feeding the beast that he believed he commanded. Rest with that thought in your mind, and know that as the tale continues, the storm will only grow louder, the shadows darker, and the path ahead far more perilous. And, when you are ready, we will step into the next chapter together, where the whispers become shouts, and the Duke's gamble leads him ever closer to the waiting blade. Now let us continue, softly, slowly, as if we are turning another page of this long, heavy book together while the night deepens around you. And I will guide you further into Philippe's story, not with sharp jolts or hurried words, but with a calm and steady rhythm that you can follow with closed eyes. The sound of history becoming almost like the lull of a distant ocean. After Philippe had stepped boldly across the chamber to join the Third Estate, after he had donned the plain black coat and declared himself aligned with the people, he might have imagined that history would forever remember him as the nobleman who turned his back on privilege and chose equality. And yet, those who lived in that time, those who felt the chill of hunger gnawing at their stomachs and the weight of taxes pressed against their shoulders, they did not see Philippe as a saint or a savior. They saw a man of immense wealth, who still lived in palaces, who still dined on delicacies, and who perhaps was merely playing another game with their lives as the pieces. This tension between appearance and reality would haunt him from that moment forward. The Palais Royal became his great stage. Imagine the arcades buzzing with commerce, merchants calling out their wares, pamphlets stacked on tables, ink still wet, spreading words sharper than swords. By night the air was thick with smoke, laughter, and whispers, a carnival of bodies and voices, where the line between entertainment and conspiracy blurred until they were one. The people of Paris poured through those galleries, their pockets light, but their ears hungry. And in every corner, someone was speaking of liberty, of bread, of vengeance against the monarchy. And above them all, in the windows of his palace, Philippe watched. He knew that the more the monarchy weakened, the stronger his hand would become. He funded presses, paid orators, even hired writers skilled in the art of scandal to stir the city into motion. One of his closest allies, Choderlos de Laclos, author of Dangerous Liaisons, used his pen not for fiction, but for politics, weaving intrigue that fanned the flames of discontent. And so, slowly, quietly, Philippe became known not only as a duke but as a shadow behind the revolution. When the bread riots erupted in October of 1789, when 20,000 women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding food, there were whispers that his carriage had been seen along the road. Whispers that he was not far from the palace when the mob stormed the Queen's bedchamber in the darkness of early morning. Queen Marie Antoinette, terrified and breathless. It was certain in her heart that Philippe had orchestrated it all, though no evidence could ever prove it. Yet suspicion has a way of staining a man's reputation more deeply than fact, and from then on the Queen would never speak of him without venom. For Philippe, these suspicions were not a burden, but a sign that his influence was working, that the monarchy trembled because of him. And so he pressed forward, renouncing his feudal rights on the night of August 4th, Seventen Altunine, sacrificing enormous rents and dues that had once filled his coffers, as if to prove to the people that he, too, would give up privilege for the sake of equality. But beneath the surface, this was not an act of humility. It was a calculated gamble. He was willing to burn part of his fortune if it meant gaining the loyalty of the crowd. The truth was that Philippe desired not only survival but power. And power, in revolutionary France, meant appearing as the loudest, boldest defender of liberty. The years between 1789 and 1792 were years of constant upheaval. The monarchy faltered. The National Assembly roared with debate, and the streets of Paris filled again and again with the shouts of protest and the smell of blood. During the September massacres of 1792, when hundreds of prisoners were slaughtered in their cells, Philippe aligned himself with the radicals, defending the killings as necessary justice. For the first time, his hands were red, not only with ambition, but with blood. And then, in a symbolic gesture of transformation, he renounced his noble title entirely. The Duke of Orleans ceased to exist, and in his place stood citizen Égalité, equality itself, a man reborn as a revolutionary symbol. It is strange, almost surreal, to imagine such a man, once clothed in silk and gold, now dressing in plain coats, sitting side by side with radicals, whispering strategy to Robespierre while keeping just enough distance from the Girondins to avoid sharing their fate. He played the game like a master gambler, shifting his stance, aligning with whoever seemed most powerful in the moment, always believing he could slip between the blades of fate unharmed. And yet, in every card he played, the deck was being reshuffled by forces far beyond his control. Then came the trial of Louis XVI, and here Philippe made the decision that sealed his destiny forever. When his turn came to speak, the chamber silenced itself, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, and he declared his vote for death. That one choice, those 4 words, were both the peak of his power and the beginning of his downfall. The people cheered, some in awe that royal blood could condemn royal blood, while others recoiled, sensing in his act not courage but betrayal so deep that it could never be washed away. Even among the revolutionaries, many could not trust a man who had voted to kill his own cousin. If he could betray a king, could he not betray anyone, In the months that followed, the revolution grew more violent, more paranoid, more unforgiving. The Committee of Public Safety rose like a new throne, its members deciding who would live and who would die. And each week, dozens more were dragged to the guillotine. Philippe, once the man who believed he could control the storm, now found himself caught in its winds, uncertain which faction might turn against him. His son defected to the Austrians, and suddenly whispers of treason clung to him like a second skin. He had thought that renouncing his title, funding the revolution, and even voting for the king's death would buy him safety. But the revolution had no loyalty. It only devoured. And here, dear listener, is where I want you to pause for a moment, to picture Philippe alone in his chambers. No longer the confident duke, but a man growing restless, pacing beneath candlelight, his thoughts clouded with fear. He dare not speak aloud. The Palais Royal, that once echoed with laughter and plots, now seemed a cavern of suspicion. Every corner, a possible betrayal. Every servant, a potential spy. Even as he tried to continue with his life, sipping coffee at his gilded table, attending salons that now felt colder, he could feel the tide rising against him. Let the image drift in your mind, a man who had once seemed untouchable, now walking with the heavy tread of dread, trying to convince himself that he still held control while the noose was already tightening. And as you breathe slowly, as your body sinks deeper into stillness, remember that history is not only made by grand speeches and dramatic executions, it is also made in these quiet moments, in the restless nights where a man realizes too late that the storm he fed will never let him go. Philippe Égalité, the man who thought he could gamble with revolution, was already a prisoner long before his cell door closed. And as we move further, we will follow him into that prison, into the days when the walls pressed close and the guillotine drew nearer with each passing hour. But for now, rest with this thought that ambition, no matter how cleverly dressed, can turn into the sharpest chain, binding a man until the crowd itself decides the hour of his fall. Let us drift deeper now, keeping our voices soft, as if this story is meant not to jolt you awake, but to cradle you gently into the darker corners of history. Because where we left Philippe Égalité, he was already slipping from the illusion of control into the cold grip of inevitability. And to understand the path he walked in those final months, we must move carefully, slowly, imagining the sights, the sounds, and the silence that surrounded him as the revolution began to consume the very man who once believed he could steer it. After Philippe cast his fatal vote for the execution of Louis XVI, he found himself standing in a strange and lonely place, celebrated by some, despised by others, and mistrusted by nearly everyone. To the radical Montagnards he was useful for a moment, a symbol that even royal blood could betray the throne. But once that symbolism was spent, they looked at him with cold suspicion. To the Girondins he was a turncoat, a man who had aligned with whichever side promised him survival. To the common people, he was neither fully one of them nor fully of the nobility any longer. He was an in-between figure, and in a time of feverish loyalty tests, being in between was the most dangerous place of all. The Palais Royal, once alive with voices and laughter, began to take on a different mood. Quieter, edgier, filled with rumors that lingered in the corners like smoke. The very pamphlets that had once poured from its presses now began to turn on Philippe, whispering of treachery, of secret accounts in Switzerland, of meetings with foreign envoys who spoke German or English or Austrian tongues. Ach Rumor, whether true or false, clung to him, growing heavier day by day. He had thought himself the collector of secrets, but now the secrets collected him, each one a weight, dragging him closer to the abyss. It was in the spring of 1793, when France was at war with nearly all of Europe. That suspicion hardened into accusation. His own son, the young Louis Philippe, defected to the Austrians, fleeing across battle lines to join the enemies of the Republic. For a father, the betrayal must have been a wound deeper than any blade. But for the Committee of Public Safety, it was proof enough that the blood of Orléans could never truly belong to the people. Saint-Just and Robespierre began to assemble a dossier thick with allegations, intercepted letters. Reports of money moved quietly into foreign banks. Testimony from servants who whispered of private meetings and coded correspondence. To them, the evidence was clear. And when the committee believed, the verdict was already written. On a July morning, before the sun had fully risen, the guards arrived at the Palais Royal with an arrest warrant. Philippe was at breakfast, sipping café au lait and breaking bread. When the officers entered, in another time, another world, perhaps he might have smiled and finished his coffee. But that morning the revolution allowed no such grace. He was taken away at once, led out of his palace and through streets, where once he had been cheered, but now was met with stares of cold indifference. The man who had voted for a king's death was now himself a prisoner of the Republic, bound for the stone walls of the conciergerie. The conciergerie was not a place designed for comfort. It was a holding chamber for death, the final stop for nobles, priests, rebels, and ordinary citizens before the guillotine claimed them. Its cells were narrow, dark, damp with the smell of straw and rot. Philippe was confined to a space barely 2 meters by 1.5, walls pressing in close, a straw pallet on the floor, and an iron bucket that served as a toilet. Here the Duke, who once reclined on silk sheets and dined beneath chandeliers, was reduced to the same condition as thieves and vagrants. The humiliation was not simply physical, it was spiritual, stripping away the illusions he had wrapped around himself, forcing him to confront the stark truth that he was no different, no safer, than those he had helped condemn. Yet Philippe was not entirely alone in his misery. His cellmates included the Duke of Biron and the Count of Batz, men who had once been his rivals in power, but were now bound together by the same fate. The irony was thick men who had plotted against each other in salons, now whispered in the darkness of prison, their voices echoing against the stone, waiting for footsteps that might come to call one of their names to the tribunal. They were united by fear, and in that fear, the walls of nobility and rivalry crumbled, leaving only 3 men staring into the same abyss. The Revolutionary Tribunal began its proceedings against Philippe in October of 1793. Presiding over the trial were judges Herman and Dumas, men hardened by countless hearings, men who no longer had patience for excuses or defense. The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, had already earned a reputation as the executioner's herald, the man whose words sent dozens of nobles, priests, and even Marie Antoinette herself to the scaffold. For him, Philippe's case was not difficult. It was an opportunity to show that no one, not even a man who had betrayed his king, could escape justice when suspicion of treason hung in the air. Over 30 days, witness after witness was brought forward. Servants spoke of hidden letters. Bankers revealed accounts in Geneva. Prostitutes from the galleries of the Palais Royal testified that foreign men had paid them to deliver messages under Philippe's orders. A Capuchin monk turned revolutionary produced intercepted correspondence between Philippe and his son. Now with the Austrian army, detailing French troop movements and supply lines. To the court it was damning. To Philippe, it was the collapse of every defense he had imagined. He argued that the letters were forgeries, but handwriting analysis proved otherwise. He insisted that he was protecting his family's fortune, not betraying France. But the tribunal laughed. For in the fever of revolution, even a shadow of disloyalty was enough to seal one's fate. As the trial unfolded, Philippe must have replayed the memory of his vote for the king's execution, clinging to it as a last desperate proof of loyalty. But when he raised it, Judge Dumas silenced him with a cold remark. Regicide means nothing when followed by treason. In that moment, Philippe surely understood that he had no allies left, that the very act he had once believed would guarantee his survival was now only another stain upon his soul. On November 5th, the verdict was delivered guilty of conspiracy against the Republic, guilty of intelligence with the enemy, guilty of treason punishable by death. His sentence was clear and merciless execution within 24 hours. The man who had tried to ride the storm had been broken by it, and now he was given less than one day to reckon with the life he had lived. That night in the conciergerie was his last. He was not given peace to compose letters of farewell, for any words he tried to write were confiscated and burned. He was not allowed to craft himself into a martyr. The Republic demanded not only his blood, but his silence. And so he passed those final hours in a cell colder than the November air outside, the straw beneath him damp, the candlelight flickering low. If he spoke to his cellmates, if he prayed, if he whispered to himself in the darkness, history does not tell us. What it does tell us is that by dawn, the cart was waiting, the tumbril with its iron wheels, ready to carry him through the streets to the waiting guillotine. Pause here for a moment, dear listener, and let the image settle gently in your mind. Philippe Égalité, once the master of palaces, reduced to a prisoner staring at stone walls, awaiting the morning that would bring his end. Let the thought sink slowly, like the dimming of a candle in a quiet room, and feel the stillness that follows. His journey was not yet finished, for the streets of Paris and the roar of the crowd awaited him. But for tonight we leave him here, in that silence before dawn, knowing that the storm he tried to command has finally wrapped him in its grasp. Let us drift further now, as if we are floating gently down a river at night, the air cool and still, and I will carry you into part 5 of this story, a continuation of the dark path. Philippe Égalité walked after his trial had ended, after the judges pronounced the words that no man could ever escape. Guilty, condemned, sentenced to die within one day. And now he entered into those final hours, when time slows down and every moment stretches long and heavy, when each breath becomes a reminder of how few are left, and the world outside seems both close enough to touch and impossibly far away. The night after his sentence was delivered was bitterly cold, November settling over Paris with a sharp edge, the Seine crusted with sheets of ice, the wind cutting through stone walls and narrow alleys, and inside the conciergerie, the chill was even more merciless. For stone holds cold the way memory holds sorrow, and Philippe lay on his straw pallet, listening to the muffled sounds of guards' footsteps and the distant drip of water. He had once lived in chambers where music played until dawn, where velvet curtains trapped the warmth of firelight. But now his world was reduced to 4 damp walls, a flickering candle, and the knowledge that the morning light would be his last. Perhaps he closed his eyes. Perhaps he thought of the son who had fled to the Austrians, or of his daughter whom he would never see again. Perhaps he whispered a prayer, though he had refused the church in his final hours. Or perhaps he lay in silence, resigned, for the Republic demanded not only his body but his quiet submission to the role they had cast for him. When morning finally came, it was pale and bitter, the sun weak behind a sky of grey, and the streets of Paris already stirring with anticipation. Executions had become not only punishment, but spectacle, a theatre of blood, where the people could take revenge on centuries of oppression. And news of Philippe's impending death spread quickly, drawing thousands into the streets long before the tumbril left the prison. By 8 o'clock in the morning, crowds lined the route, their breath steaming in the air, their voices murmuring with excitement. And by 10, tens of thousands had gathered, not just to watch but to taste vengeance, to see the blood of Orleans spill into the dust. At 10:30, the wooden cart was rolled to the prison gate, its wheels iron-bound, its frame rough and unyielding, known by all as the tumbril, the cart of death. Philippe was brought out, dressed in a plain brown coat and white silk stockings, his hair shorn the night before so that the blade would fall clean. And though his clothes were simple, they could not hide the bearing of a man who had once walked through palaces. He climbed into the cart, the wood creaking beneath him, and the procession began, slow and deliberate, the horses pulling him over cobblestones that jolted his body with every turn. The journey was 2 kilometers, but it stretched across 23 minutes of humiliation, as the crowd pressed in on either side, shouting, jeering, hurling insults and objects alike. First it was cabbages, then rotten apples, then clumps of mud, and soon stones from a construction site were thrown, and chamber pots emptied onto his coat. The guards did not intervene, for this too was part of revolutionary justice, to allow the people to release their fury, to show that not even a duke could escape their contempt. Philippe sat in silence, the wheels rattling beneath him, his hands gripping the edge of the cart, his spine jarred by each bump, and though he had prepared words to speak at the scaffold, though he had imagined himself dying with dignity, here in the streets, he was stripped of even that, his voice drowned by the relentless roar of the crowd. The square of the Place de la Révolution loomed ahead, a vast open space where already 15,000 had gathered, pressing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lifted toward the scaffold that rose nearly 4 meters high in the center, painted blood red to disguise the stains. Upon it stood the guillotine itself, its oak frame dark and solid, the blade of 40 kilograms gleaming as it hung suspended above the lunette, the slot through which necks passed, a machine designed to be swift and merciful in theory, but here turned into a symbol of merciless justice. Dr. Guillotine had intended it as a humane invention, a clean death compared to the axe or sword. But the crowd did not come for humanity. They came for the spectacle of vengeance, and they would accept nothing less. At 11:37, the cart reached the scaffold, and Philippe was ordered to climb the 13 wooden steps. He ascended slowly, each step echoing in the ears of those who watched, each step another beat of the drum of fate. He wore no wig, his neck bare, his face pale against the cold, and he carried with him the speech he had prepared. Words of liberty, words of sacrifice. Perhaps words meant to convince the people that he had died not as a traitor but as a citizen of the Republic. But as he opened his mouth, a roar surged from below, drowning him entirely. 15,000 voices crying out death to the traitor, and the sound rolled through the square like thunder. Rotten fruit and clumps of mud rained upon the scaffold, and even a dead cat was hurled upward. Striking the platform with a thud, Philippe could not be heard, his last words smothered by the hatred of the crowd. And in that moment he understood that no dignity, no eloquence, no gesture could redeem him in their eyes. He was not Philippe Égalité, not citizen equality, not even a duke. He was merely prey caught in the jaws of the revolution, and the crowd demanded silence. At 11:41, the executioner and his assistants seized him, forcing him onto the plank, locking his neck into the lunette, the cold wood pressing against his skin, The roar of the crowd swelled until it was deafening, and witnesses later swore that the noise was so overwhelming they could not even hear his final breath. At 11:42, the rope was released, the blade dropped, and in an instant the life of Philippe Égalité was ended, severed cleanly through the fourth cervical vertebrae, his head tumbling into the wicker basket with a wet thud. But the story did not end in that clean moment. Before the executioner could even lift the head for display, the crowd surged forward, breaking past barriers, tearing at his clothing, dipping rags into his blood, splintering pieces of the scaffold as souvenirs. Some sold scraps of cloth soaked in his blood later in the gardens of the Tuileries. 2 sous apiece, relics of vengeance that ordinary people could carry home as proof that justice had been served. For them, it was not enough to see him die. They needed to consume the death itself, to hold it, to taste it, to make it part of their own victory. By afternoon, his body and head were carted away to the cemetery of Clamart on the outskirts of Paris, dumped into lime pits among dozens of others executed that week. Unmarked, unblessed, destined to vanish into the earth without a name. But even here, even in this final anonymity, his story did not rest. 3 months later, when gravediggers reopened the pits, they discovered something unsettling. The record spoke of 38 bodies, but 41 were found, and among them a corpse that bore marks of a struggle. Fingernails broken and packed with dirt, bruises on the throat, scratches along the arms, the unmistakable signs of a man who had clawed at the ground in desperation. Could it have been Philippe himself, had the guillotine failed to kill him instantly, leaving him stunned, unconscious, only to awaken beneath earth and lime, buried alive, suffocating, his final moments spent clawing and gasping in darkness? The officials silenced the discovery, altered the records, and forbade further questions. But the rumour spread nonetheless, and in taverns and back alleys, in salons and streets, people whispered that Philippe's true punishment had not been the blade, but the grave itself. And now, dear listener, let your mind rest upon that haunting thought, that perhaps the man who thought he could ride the storm of revolution did not die in the clean mercy of the guillotine, but in the suffocating silence of earth pressed against his lips, his hands tearing at soil until the last breath was stolen from him. Whether true or not, it is a whisper that lingers in the pages of history, a shadow that clings to his name. And as you close your eyes and let your breathing slow, you can almost hear the silence of that pit, the cold embrace of lime and soil, and the truth that ambition cannot escape the hunger of the crowd. Now we move into part 6, and I ask you to stay with me in this quiet rhythm, as if I am reading to you in the stillness of night, my voice carrying you gently from one image to the next, not rushing, not breaking, but flowing like a soft current, because the story of Philippe Égalité does not end with the fall of the blade. It continues in the echo of his death, in the ripples that spread through his family, his country, and the strange irony that history carved into his legacy. After the guillotine had silenced him, after his body was carried away and thrown into a lime pit among the nameless dead, Paris did not pause, for executions had become part of the daily rhythm. One more name, one more head, one more roar of the crowd, and the revolution continued to devour without hesitation. For the ordinary citizens who dipped rags into his blood and sold them as relics, Philippe's death was not an end, but a souvenir, a token of revenge to be carried home, something to prove that even the richest of men could be dragged into the dust. Yet in the quiet chambers of his surviving family, his death was a different story, one of grief, fear, and uncertain futures. His son, Louis Philippe, had already fled, carrying with him the heavy mark of betrayal, branded a traitor by the Republic for joining Austrian forces. In the months after his father's death, the young man wandered through exile, moving across Europe, seeking both safety and a place where he might still belong. And it was exile that would shape him, exile that would harden him, and exile that would, in a twist of irony, prepare him to one day wear the very crown his father had tried to bury. At that time, however, there was no guarantee of survival, no promise of return, only the long shadows of suspicion that followed any son of the Orléans line. Back in Paris, whispers of Philippe's death swirled through salons and taverns, whispers that perhaps he had not truly died beneath the guillotine, but had awakened beneath the earth, clawing and suffocating. And whether true or false, the rumor gave the people a sense of satisfaction that the punishment had been even harsher than intended. The officials worked to suppress such talk, altering records, stamping their seals upon silence. But rumors are smoke, and smoke slips through any crack. And so the legend lived on, feeding the imagination of a city already steeped in blood and paranoia. And so, Philippe's death was not only an execution, it became a story. And stories in times of revolution carried weight, shaping how people saw themselves, how they saw justice, how they saw power. For the Montagnards, his end was proof that no drop of royal blood could ever be trusted, that the Republic must purge even those who pretended loyalty. For the Girondins, it was evidence of the revolution's mercilessness, the way it turned, even on those who had aided it. For the ordinary people it was simple. A man born into wealth had finally been brought low, and for one brief day, vengeance tasted sweet. Yet beyond the streets of Paris, beyond the noise of the crowds, history was weaving a longer thread, one that stretched decades into the future. Louis Philippe, the son who had fled, wandered through Switzerland, hid in the countryside, served in foreign armies, lived on a falsonemus, and carried with him both shame and hope. He watched the revolution from afar, watched as Robespierre himself fell, watched as the terror devoured its own architects, watched Napoleon rise and crown himself emperor, watched empires fall and coalitions shift. And through it all he survived. Patient, careful, waiting. Decades later, when France was once again exhausted by kings and emperors, when the people longed for something different, Louis Philippe returned. It was 1830, and the Bourbon line had stumbled under the weight of its own rigidity. And into that vacuum stepped the son of Philippe Égalité, the exile, the wanderer, the man who had carried the stain of treachery all his life. The people welcomed him not as a Bourbon but as a citizen king, the one monarch they believed could bridge the gap between nobility and nation. He ascended the throne, not with divine right, but with the claim of popular will. And for a time it seemed as though the irony was complete. The son of the duke who voted for a king's death had become a king himself. But history does not forget so easily. And even as Louis Philippe ruled, the shadow of his father's death lingered. The whisper of betrayal clung to the Orléans name. The memory of Philippe's vote for death, his life of gambling with revolution, his final humiliation upon the scaffold. Louis Philippe tried to shape himself into a monarch of the people, tried to walk among them with modest manners, tried to distance himself from the arrogance of past kings. But beneath the surface, suspicion never fully died. For how could the people ever truly trust the blood of a man who had betrayed both crown and republic? As you rest here with me, let the image drift in your mind of this long arc of irony, a father who thought he could destroy monarchy but was destroyed himself. and a son who wore the very crown that the father had tried to topple. It is one of those patterns in history that feels almost like fate, as though some unseen hand delights in weaving contradiction into the fabric of human lives. And the more you think on it, the softer your breath becomes, the slower your thoughts drift, as if history itself is a lullaby, carrying you from one paradox to the next. And beyond the irony, there is also the lesson that ambition, when tied to betrayal, often eats itself. That power taken without loyalty crumbles. That those who believe they can command the fury of the crowd almost always discover that the crowd commands them instead. Philippe Égalité believed he was clever, believed he was untouchable, believed his wealth and his gestures of equality would shield him. But the revolution had no interest in gestures. It had no mercy for half measures. It demanded everything. And in the end, it devoured him just as it devoured so many others. So here, at the close of part 6, let yourself imagine the silence after his death. The city moving on. The lime pit closing over him. The rumor of his burial alive, haunting those who dared whisper it. And the son far away, wandering, carrying the burden of his name. History is not only made by moments of fire and steel, it is also made by the silence that follows, by the echoes that stretch across years, by the children who inherit not only fortunes but legacies heavy with shame. Philippe's story did not end at the guillotine. It lived on in whispers, in rumors, in ironies, and in the strange way that power continues to circle back upon itself. Let us move gently into part 7 now, carrying with us the echoes of what has already passed, letting the thread of this story continue to unspool in long, quiet lines, each one soft and steady, because what followed the death of Philippe Égalité was not merely the closing of one man's life, but the widening of a shadow across all of France. A shadow that revealed how revolutions, when driven by fear and suspicion, can become storms that devour their own children. After Philippe's execution, the streets of Paris did not grow calmer. They grew louder, darker, filled with suspicion so thick it was like smoke in the lungs. For his death was only one in a relentless procession. One more body among thousands. And yet his blood carried a special weight because he had been a duke, because he had been of royal blood. And when the crowd saw him fall, they knew no one was untouchable. And from that realization came both triumph and terror. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre and his circle, wielded authority, like a blade drawn always from its sheath. And with each day, new names were written down, new arrests carried out, new trials staged that were less about evidence and more about performance. Less about guilt and more about maintaining the constant rhythm of fear. The revolution, which had once spoken in lofty words about liberty and fraternity, now spoke in the language of death. And in that language there was no room for hesitation, no space for compromise, no breath that did not tremble. For ordinary citizens, the days became a blur of executions announced on posters, carts rumbling toward the Place de la Révolution, and the sight of yet another head falling into the wicker basket. And in such a world it was easier to whisper than to speak, easier to bow one's head than to raise it, easier to pretend loyalty than to question. And in this climate, Philippe's death became a kind of marker, a reminder, whispered in corners, that if even he, who had voted for the king's death, who had abandoned his title and taken the name Equality, could not survive, then truly no one could believe themselves safe. The terror deepened as the year turned, and by the summer of 1794, the blade had claimed tens of thousands. Among them, men and women who had once shouted the loudest for liberty. Among them, figures who had sat beside Robespierre and argued about the future of France. And so it was that the revolution, having consumed aristocrats and monarchists, now began to consume its own leaders. The same tribunal that had silenced Philippe now silenced Danton, Desmoulins, Hebert, and in time even Robespierre himself, whose voice once shook the assembly, but whose jaw was shattered by a bullet before the guillotine claimed him. And so the crowd that had roared for Philippe roared again, not because they hated him uniquely, but because hatred had become habit, vengeance had become entertainment, and the rhythm of execution had become the pulse of the city. Through it all, the memory of Philippe lingered like a ghost, not because he was mourned, but because his story was so steeped in irony that it could not be forgotten. He had believed himself clever enough to play both sides, rich enough to purchase influence, bold enough to betray his cousin the king, confident enough to rename himself as the embodiment of equality. But in the end, none of it mattered, for the revolution could never truly trust him, and his death became the very proof that the crowd required, proof that no wealth, no name, no gesture could outwit the hunger of the blade. And while Paris drowned itself in fear, his son wandered in exile, moving through Switzerland, Italy, and Northern Europe, living under false names, watching from afar as the revolution first blazed, then turned inward, then collapsed into itself. And for Louis Philippe, the lessons were written in blood and silence. He learned that power without legitimacy was fragile, that gestures without loyalty were fatal, that survival required patience, and that the wheel of history always turned back to those who endured long enough to see it complete its circle. In the quiet of exile, he must have carried the image of his father's last ride, the roar of the mob, the silence of the grave, and he must have felt the burden of his name as both curse and future opportunity. The revolution eventually gave way to the rise of Napoleon, a man who crowned himself emperor, who promised order after chaos, who offered discipline after frenzy. And yet even in this new empire, the memory of the terror lingered, etched into the minds of all who had lived through it. A memory of neighbors denouncing neighbors, of whispers that became death sentences, of loyalty tested and found wanting. And within that memory, the story of Philippe Égalité endured, not as a tale of heroism, but as a warning. A reminder that ambition disguised as equality could not shield one from suspicion. That betrayal, dressed as loyalty, could not save a man from the crowd's hunger. As you listen to this now, let your mind picture Paris in those years. The narrow streets, shadowed by tall buildings, the scent of smoke and bread and fear mingling in the air, the posters nailed to walls announcing the names of the condemned, the carts rattling each morning, the guillotine standing in the square like a monument to justice turned merciless. Imagine the silence that fell after each execution, broken only by vendors selling scraps of cloth dipped in blood, relics of vengeance sold for a few coins. And in that silence, imagine the thought that must have passed through many hearts. If Philippe Égalité could fall, then so could we all. And now let that image soften. Let the edges blur, as if the streets are fading into mist and the sounds are growing quieter. Because what remains from this chapter of history is not only the horror of the blade, but the lesson of how revolutions, once they begin to devour, do not stop until they have consumed even their own creators. Philippe believed he could guide the storm, but he was only ever one more branch caught in the wind, broken, carried away, forgotten by some, remembered by others only as a whisper, a rumor, a caution. So here, at the close of Part 7, rest with this thought: the revolution was a fire that consumed kings and dukes, priests and peasants, radicals and moderates alike. and in its glow Philippe's ambition burned away until nothing remained but ash and rumour. His story did not bring peace to France. It did not end the hunger of the people. It did not build the new world he had imagined. It only proved once more that no one, not even those who believed themselves cleverest, could escape the judgment of a crowd set aflame. Let us drift now into part 8, continuing seamlessly from where we left. And as my voice settles into a steady rhythm, I invite you to relax even more deeply, to let the weight of your body sink, as though you are lying on calm waters, and I will guide you further into the echoes of Philippe Égalité's story. Not only his fall, but the strange fate of France after his death. For the revolution did not end with his blood. It carried forward, mutating into new forms. And the irony of history grew even sharper as decades passed, weaving together threads of betrayal, exile, and unexpected return. When the blade fell upon Philippe and the crowd roared its satisfaction, Paris believed it had cut away one more symbol of tyranny. Yet the city did not know that in doing so, it had also planted seeds that would bloom many years later in ways none could have foreseen. His son, Louis Philippe, wandered far from France, driven by fear, branded a traitor because he had fled to the Austrians, and his exile carried him across the landscapes of Europe like a restless ghost. He lived under false names. He taught for a time in Switzerland. He travelled through Scandinavia, and in each place he learned the art of survival, the art of patience, the art of waiting for the wheel of fortune to turn again. Imagine him as a young man, no longer clothed in splendour but in simple attire, walking through mountain valleys with only a few coins in his pocket, watching from afar as France devoured itself. And slowly he began to understand that power is not always taken by force. Sometimes it is won by endurance, by outlasting those who burn too brightly and too quickly. Meanwhile, in France, the revolution's fever reached its breaking point. The terror consumed Robespierre himself, and his fall brought relief, but also exhaustion, for the people had lived too long in fear. And into that weariness marched Napoleon Bonaparte, a soldier who rose like a comet, offering order after chaos, glory after shame. Under Napoleon, France expanded, conquered, crowned itself anew, and for a time, it seemed as though the revolution's madness had been replaced by discipline. Yet the memory of the guillotine, the memory of those thousands of deaths, the memory of Philippe Égalité and others who had fallen, lingered in the minds of all, a reminder of how fragile life and loyalty truly were. Louis Philippe watched from abroad as Napoleon rose and then fell, as the Bourbon monarchy returned in the form of Louis XVIII and later Charles X, and he understood that history was not linear, it was circular, and that what was torn down one decade could be rebuilt the next. He waited. He survived. He learned to present himself not as a Bourbon tyrant, but as a man of the people. A prince who had lived in exile, a man who had tasted both hardship and loss. And so when France finally grew tired of Bourbon rigidity once more, when the July Revolution of 1830 erupted, it was Louis Philippe who stepped forward, greeted not as a distant monarch, but as the citizen king, a title that gave him the air of being both ruler and ordinary man, a bridge between nobility and people. Imagine the irony of that moment. Decades after the roar of the crowd at the Place de la Révolution, when the very son of Philippe Égalité, the man who had voted for the death of his cousin the king, now placed the crown upon his own head. It was as if history had played a long joke, a circle that closed with cruel precision, and those who remembered whispered of the strange fate of the Orléans line, that the father had betrayed the monarchy only for the son to wear its crown. Yet this was not a return to the old ways. For Louis Philippe ruled as a different kind of king, modest in manner, careful in speech, walking among his people, dining simply, presenting himself as one who understood both privilege and loss. And yet even as he reigned, the ghost of his father never left him. The name Égalité carried with it the memory of betrayal, the stain of regicide, the whispers of a death, perhaps even more gruesome than the guillotine, buried alive in lime, clawing in darkness. For the enemies of Louis Philippe, the memory was a weapon, proof that the blood of Orleans could not be trusted, that betrayal ran in the family like an inheritance. For his supporters, it was a reminder that this king was different, not a Bourbon clinging to divine right, but a man shaped by revolution, by exile, by the lessons of his father's fall. And in this way the story of Philippe Égalité lived on, not as a closed chapter, but as a thread woven into the fabric of 19th century France, haunting each decision his son made, haunting the monarchy itself. For every time Louis Philippe tried to show himself as a man of the people, there were those who remembered the crowd screaming at his father's scaffold, those who remembered that the guillotine spares no one, not even those who claim to stand for equality. The shadow of betrayal was always near, and the irony of monarchy restored by the son of a regicide never ceased to trouble the conscience of France. As you rest here now, let this image settle quietly in your mind. A father who died beneath the roar of the mob, a son who returned decades later to wear the crown, and between them, the endless turning of history's wheel, always circling back, always reminding us that power is fleeting, that loyalty is fragile, that ambition can twist itself into irony. Let it drift in your thoughts like the faint sound of bells carried on the night air, distant yet clear, a reminder that history whispers not only through books, but through the echoes that shape the present. And so, Part 8 closes with this reflection. Philippe Égalité thought he could master the revolution, but he became its victim. His son thought he could learn from that fate. And for a time he succeeded. Yet even he could not escape the truth that no crown sits securely for long in France. The people who once demanded liberty would demand it again. The people who once roared for vengeance would roar again. And the cycle of ambition, betrayal, and downfall would continue. Now, let us wander together into Part 9, the final movement of this long and haunting story, and I invite you to settle more deeply into stillness, to let your breath become slow and easy. For what we are about to explore is not only the conclusion of Philippe Égalité's journey, but the lingering echo of his choices, the way his death, and the strange irony of his son's rise, would continue to shape France long after the guillotine had fallen silent. History has a way of refusing to end cleanly, and though Philippe's body was buried in a lime pit, though the crowd roared with satisfaction at his death, his name continued to move like a shadow through the years that followed. His son's reign as citizen king might have looked like redemption, might have seemed to close the circle by turning shame into legitimacy. Yet beneath the crown lay the same unease, the same tension that had haunted France since the first heads fell. Louis Philippe tried to rule with modesty, walking through Paris in simple clothes, greeting his subjects without the heavy pomp of Bourbon kings, presenting himself as one of them. Yet in every gesture there was still suspicion, for the people remembered, and they whispered, that his father had once stood in the assembly and voted for death, that he had once betrayed his own cousin, and that such blood could never be fully trusted. In the salons of Paris, where once Philippe Égalité had poured his fortune to nurture Enlightenment thinkers, his ghost seemed to linger. Writers and speakers remembered him not as a hero but as a warning. They recalled the way he had tried to ride the storm of revolution, the way he had gambled on equality and lost everything, the way his name had been changed, But his fate had not. And as France moved from monarchy to empire, from empire back to monarchy, and from monarchy again to a fragile kind of republic, the lesson of Philippe remained like a line written in the margins of every new constitution. That ambition, when disguised as loyalty, leads only to suspicion. That betrayal dressed in noble words cannot hold the trust of a nation. And that power borrowed from the people can never truly be secured against the people. Even beyond France, in the courts of Europe, Philippe's story was remembered with a kind of morbid fascination. To kings and princes, it was proof of how dangerous ideas could be. Proof of how fragile the bonds of loyalty were when nobles themselves turned against the crown. To revolutionaries in other lands, it was both an inspiration and a warning. For here was a noble who had claimed equality, who had thrown in his lot with the people, but who had been destroyed by the very forces he unleashed. He became both an example of courage and a symbol of futility, a man whose name meant equality, but whose fate meant death. And then there is the rumor, the haunting whisper that has never quite been silenced. The story that perhaps Philippe did not die instantly beneath the blade, that perhaps his body was buried alive in lime, his fingernails torn and broken as he clawed against the earth, his lungs filling with dust and suffocation. That rumor, though suppressed, never fully vanished, and in its persistence, it gave his death an even darker hue. For those who hated him, it was justice more fitting than the guillotine, punishment for betrayal that seemed poetic in its cruelty. For those who pitied him, it was a horror too grim to contemplate, a reminder that the revolution was not only merciless, but careless, indifferent to whether a man suffered beyond the moment of spectacle. And so the rumor lived on, another layer of irony, another shadow stretching across his name. The years moved forward, and Louis Philippe's reign came and went, collapsing in 1848 when another wave of revolution swept through France, proving once again that no crown in that land could remain steady for long. He fled into exile, just as his father's line had done before, and with him, the Orléans' dream of a citizen monarchy faded. But Philippe Égalité remained, not in body, but in story, a figure caught between roles, too noble to be trusted as a revolutionary, too revolutionary to be trusted as a noble, a man who tried to bridge two worlds and was crushed between them. His life and death became a parable retold in whispers, a cautionary tale about the hunger of crowds, the illusion of control, and the merciless rhythm of history. And now, as you listen, as your body grows heavy with rest, consider the wider arc of what his story tells us about human ambition. He was born into immense wealth, into a family that commanded lands and fortunes beyond imagination, and yet he was restless, dissatisfied, always reaching for more, believing that by embracing new ideas and aligning with new forces, he could place himself at the center of history. He tried to wear the mask of equality. He tried to cast off the robes of nobility. He tried to convince himself and others that he could be both prince and citizen, both duke and revolutionary. But masks wear thin, and the crowd always sees through them. And in the end, the crowd decided not to listen to his words, but to take his head. History has preserved his name, but not with admiration. His legacy is a mixture of irony and suspicion, a reminder that betrayal never truly brings safety, that ambition without loyalty leaves only ashes. His story is one of those threads that tie the French Revolution together, a revolution that promised liberty but delivered terror, a revolution that claimed to honor the people but fed endlessly on their blood. Philippe's tale is woven into that fabric, a single thread of wealth, ambition, betrayal, execution, and rumor, and though centuries have passed, the whisper of it still chills the air when we speak his name. So as we bring this journey to a close, let us rest in the silence that follows. The silence of a lime pit outside Paris. The silence of a son wandering in exile. The silence of a crown that rests uneasily upon the head of any French king. Let the story of Philippe Égalité drift away now like a candle guttering at the end of its wick, leaving behind the faint trace of smoke, the faint memory of light, and the lesson that power taken at the expense of trust is power that dissolves into nothing. And as you close your eyes, as your breathing softens, let that lesson sink gently into you, not as fear, but as the quiet knowledge that history is always watching, and that in the end, the crowd, the people, the tide of time itself, will always have the final word. All right, let us close this long journey with a soft epilogue, as though I am tucking the entire story gently into place. A final lullaby of history for you to drift away with. We have walked together through 9 long parts, each one unfolding the rise and fall of Philippe Égalité. From his glittering birth in 1747 to his reckless choices in the salons of Enlightenment Paris. From his betrayal of the monarchy and his infamous vote for the death of Louis XVI, to the cold stone of the Conciergerie and the final roar of the crowd at the Place de la Révolution. We have wandered through the rumor of his burial alive, the silence of his lime pit grave, the exile of his son, and the strange irony of that son's return as citizen king, only to fall once more into exile. His story is not one of victory, nor one of glory, but of warning. It reminds us that ambition without loyalty turns into suspicion, that betrayal disguised as virtue becomes its own punishment, that no amount of wealth or cleverness can shield a man from the judgment of history. And yet, his story also lingers because it is deeply human, filled with contradiction and irony, filled with the restless hunger that drives men to believe they can control storms that will always be greater than themselves. So now, as we close the book on Philippe Égalité, let the noise of Paris fade into silence. The crowds disperse. The scaffold stands empty. The streets grow quiet. In the distance, the Seine flows on, as it always has, carrying with it the memory of a city that has seen kings crowned and kings destroyed. And Philippe himself, once a duke, once a citizen, once a traiteur, now becomes only a whisper in the long corridors of time. Let that whisper drift away, gentle as the sound of wind in autumn leaves, and let yourself rest in the thought that history, for all its cruelty, is also a lullaby, reminding us that everything passes, that even the fiercest storms eventually fall silent, and that in the end, all ambition dissolves into the calm of memory. Sleep well now, with the story of Philippe Égalité behind you, knowing that his tale is not only history but also a mirror, reflecting the dangers of power and the fragility of trust, and that in the quiet of night, with your eyes closed and your breath steady, you are safe from the noise of crowds and the judgment of the past.